It is now 12:30. We are recording, and I just want to allow a couple minutes for people to trickle in. It's always hard to know what geographies are going to join. I imagine less from China at this time, but you never know. I'll just do a quick introduction in a couple of minutes.
Sounds good. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see if people want to spend their lunch talking about carbon removal. I spend every lunch talking about it, but I'm obviously biased.
I spend every other lunch talking about it, so not quite as much as you.
Still great outcome though. Good representation.
Yep. All right, it's 12:31, and I know people are busy, and we'll let people trickle in as well, but we'll get going here. Hi, everyone. Welcome to A Green Tomorrow, our Climate Fintech webinar. My name is Aaron McCrary. I'm the Climate Fintech lead here at New Energy Nexus. And I'm really excited today to host Brennan Spellacy, the founder and CEO of Patch. Brennan, welcome.
Hey, Aaron, thank you so much for having me. Excited to chat.
Great. Before we sort of dive in, I do want to just sort of cover a couple of housekeeping items. A little bit of context around New Energy Nexus. We are an organization that supports clean energy entrepreneurship through funds, accelerators, and networks. And our climate fintech work focuses on digital financial technology that helps to catalyze decarbonization. These efforts span a couple of geographies as well, including China, Switzerland, Singapore, and last but not least, the United States. And for those of you who haven't seen, we're currently running an initiative with Patch alongside Barclays, MasterCard, and Duconomy. It's called the Cards and Payments Challenge. Really encourage everyone to check that out, and we'll chat a little bit more about that later. So yeah, without further ado, Brennan, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you first came to create Patch.
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, thank you so much for having me. The kind of story of Patch goes back a couple of years. I grew up in New York, formally educated in chemical engineering, so I actually studied up in Canada with the intention of working in some sort of low carbon or no carbon energy system, whether it's nuclear, geothermal, things like that. Ended up only getting jobs in oil and gas out of university, which is the opposite of what I wanted to do. So I became a programmer at Shopify, and then had a tech-enabled hotel called Sonder shortly after. You can think of Sonder as like a way to compete with Marriott, but instead of having bellhops and kind of all these back office staff, everything's set up in the phone. I joined that company. It was about 15 people. It's there I met my co-founder, Aaron Grunfeld. He was the first employee at Sonder. And we helped grow that company from around 15 people to around 1,500 people at its peak when we left back in April of 2020. It was there we kind of got to know each other and work together on a wide variety of business problems. And then, back in like March, February of 2020, we're starting to get the itch to start something of our own. And we really wanted to bring it back to climate. It was the whole reason I had gotten a formal education. And for better or for worse, we're not really on the right track. And so there's kind of from a climate perspective, there's no better I couldn't think of any better thing to dive into than climate. What Patch actually is a platform for carbon removal. What that actually means is we partner with a really wide variety of both carbon removal and carbon offset developers on the supply side of our business. These are people who develop land in a way that sequesters carbon. So that could be something as familiar as reforestation or as foreign as direct air carbon capture, which are these large fans that suck CO2 out of the air, run it through a chemical reaction, the CO2 stays behind, and the pure, primarily oxygen and nitrogen come out the other side. And then make their capacity transactable electronically through the software Patch builds. And then we expose that capacity both through a visual interface, so kind of like an online shopping experience, but as well as an API. And the API is kind of our primary use case, it's our bread and butter, and we primarily use it to sell to tech-enabled businesses to launch climate-positive products and services from, anywhere from like a carbon neutral credit card to something in crypto to e-commerce. And I imagine we're going to talk a little bit more about that later.
You caught me drinking my water.
Yeah, no, sorry, I put you on the spot. I should have stalled for another minute or two.
No, that's all right. So super interesting, and I've heard you sort of describe Patch as an API first carbon removal platform. So
yeah,
for those of us out there who don't know what an API is, tell us what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. So an API is essentially how computers talk to each other. So, when a human has a UI, so you're actually seeing a screen, digesting information that's on the screen, computers, for the most part, don't have that ability. And so an API essentially enables different web applications or different programs to interface with each other. And so when we say we're API first, what that means is every piece of functionality we create, whether it's like a specific piece, a photo on a carbon removal project, whether it's the ability to place an order or create a carbon estimate, all that can be done by another computer interacting with our service. And so what that means is we actually add like one more Lego brick, if you will, to all these different software developers developing more complex programs where they can fold Patch's software into a broader application.
It's awesome. And, I've heard you guys have picked up quite a bit of traction over the last year, a lot of different types of customers, and that infers that the API itself is quite flexible. So I was just sort of curious if you could show us a couple of use cases, how this actually works.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll use this as an opportunity to quickly share my screen. So hopping over here, the major kind of use cases in general are typically us selling or working with what we call tech-enabled companies. So like a traditional law firm or something like that might not be the best fit for us. We're API first, and so typically you have to have some sort of capacity to program on the team. So you see here we have a couple broad use cases. Crypto has actually been huge for us. So for those who don't know, kind of crypto has been getting a little bit of heat in the press lately around the environmental footprint. Now, I'm not here to say, traditional finance is better or worse. But like the high level is high kind of computation efforts result in a lot of electricity use, which today result in emissions. Eventually, things will be renewable and nuclear, so that won't be a problem. But this like kind of 1 to 2 decade gap we're in, assuming you don't think crypto is going away, which we at Patch, we are actually all fairly crypto bullish. We have to have some sort of like bridge to kind of mitigate the negative environmental externalities with that. And so what we've seen, the kind of like major use cases have actually been in NFTs. So for those who don't know, an NFT is this kind of concept in crypto where it's called a non-fungible token, where you mint this non-fungible token, and that's incredibly computationally intensive. And so what Patch does is we actually give you the ability to footprint that kind of NFT. Typically, we're focusing on Bitcoin, which no NFTs are on Bitcoin, or Ethereum, which is where most NFTs are created, or some sort of Ethereum derivative chain. Essentially, come up with a carbon footprint of minting that NFT, and then people are actually piping that into some sort of carbon removal project. And the economics typically work really well because we've seen, as of late, NFTs are selling for massive, massive markups. And so there's a little bit of margin in there that actually, in many cases, makes sense to compensate environmental footprint with that. And then the second one is actually decentralized finance, where we're seeing more and more people using parts of their yield that they get from DeFi, which is essentially like your APR, right? So in decentralized finance, you might be earning 4, 5, 6% per year on some sort of cryptocurrency. Some of them are actually putting part of that yield into carbon removal. So they're calling it essentially DeFi for good. A great example of that is Popcorn, which is a customer of Patches. And then kind of the second really big vertical that we'll talk about is fintech. And this might be a little bit more intuitive, someone who's a little bit less familiar with crypto. And so this looks a little bit more like, carbon neutral credit card, where you're actually, every time you're swiping your credit card, you have, some amount of carbon intensity associated with that transaction. And we partner with someone like Economy to understand what the footprint of that transaction is. And then again, piping that value into Patch's system to effectively compensate that transaction. And then we have things like payments, where we actually have some folks putting just, not saying they're going to be carbon neutral or anything like that, but putting 1, 2, 3% of spend towards some form of carbon removal or carbon compensation mechanism. And you got to think of this as maybe a substitute for rewards. So instead of getting 1% cash back, you're getting 1% carbon removal. So it's actually no cost to the customer because the credit issuer has already built it into their margin and cost structure. So they're not expecting to get that 1% in any outcome. So that's just a couple of use cases that we've seen. We've seen a bunch of others across e-commerce, travel, and and some that I would never even like imagine. But that's a really quick overview of some of the use cases we've seen.
I love those examples, and obviously really appreciate you guys supporting this cards and payments challenge, and sharing sort of the API of yours in that context. Really excited to sort of see who uses yours and connects to the API to see what solutions come through. Just going back to the sort of basics though on carbon offsets and removals, can you talk a little bit about what an offset is and what the types of offsets are that you offer?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way to think about any form of carbon credit is essentially it's an environmental derivative. So it is issued or minted from a physical action that's taken place. And that physical action needs to be either some form of carbon removal. So CO2 has been taken out of the atmosphere or out of the carbon cycle and stored in some sort of permanent, stable way, or emissions have been permanently abated. So they've been prevented in some way. And like a really concrete example is, there are landfills in the United States that emit methane. If you prevent it from emitting methane, that's a prevented emission versus some sort of carbon removal. One kind of concrete use case. And the kind of underlying mechanism of how this all works is you have these carbon removal or carbon offset developers, and they're raising financing, developing land in a way that has this kind of positive environmental effect. There's a bunch of different ways, and depending on that way they're developing the land, so if they're building a forestry project or a dock facility or an enhanced weathering facility, there is an associated verification standard to which they must build that. They will then bring in a verifier who implements said verification standard. And once they have audited that work, they'll say, you've sequestered 1,000 tons. So therefore you may have 1,000 carbon credits, carbon offsets that you may sell to both pay back your financing you use to develop that land, as well as generate some sort of net operating income to pay for administration, the overhead of actually running a development company. So it's actually very similar to how real estate development works, right? Where, but instead of recurring revenue from rent, the way you're developing land and kind of the income you're generating is off of offsets, which tends to be a little bit less recurring and a little bit spikier. But it's kind of a very similar project finance type payback workflow.
And these offset projects, you have 40 or 50 of them. There's sort of a split between avoidance offsets and removal offsets. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So we're probably it's about half-half right now, where it's about half removal, half avoidance. And the whole idea behind Patch is really like making what's what incredibly clear and really empowering the buyer to understand what they're signing up for. One of the biggest pieces of feedback, one of those greatest weaknesses of carbon markets is the lack of transparency and structured information to make an informed decision, to actually understand what you're transacting. And what Patch really aims to do is aggregate all what we view as the high quality supply in the world and standardize like not just the price and per ton, but the geography, the permanence. So that's how long that positive environmental effect stands for, a sort of photography or rich text or multimedia, and have it all kind of in one place, and then really enable the end consumer to understand, that's why there's a price difference there, because something's in a particular geo and the permanence is twice as long, et cetera. So really looking to enable a new level of transparency to allow for apples to apples comparison within carbon markets.
Super helpful. I want to just sort of dive in. You mentioned something about a portfolio-based approach to managing carbon emissions. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of folks that use Patch specifically, as well as that don't use Patch, right? So Shopify and Microsoft have also taken this approach, which is they don't want to essentially put all of their eggs in one basket. This is an incredibly large problem, this being climate change, that's going to require a lot of different solutions. And so what we've seen is if you're allocating even as little as $100,000, which I know sounds like a lot, but for like a large technology business typically isn't very much money, they've actually tended to spread it across 3, 5, sometimes even 10 projects. And the reason they're doing that is very similar to how you would think about diversifying from an investment perspective, where there are different strengths and weaknesses to each underlying carbon removal type, where some might be very expensive, but they're permanent for 10,000 years. So you want to get as much of that option as possible on the docket. Or there are some situations where, there's this idea of insetting where, maybe forestry or agriculture is really relevant to your company's particular value chain. So you want to try allocating some of your capital to those different types of options. And so depending on like the needs of the business, as well as any sort of like R&D risk associated or budgetary requirements associated with the more expensive projects, you want to make sure you're spreading across a few options. There is the situation as well where if there's some sort of delivery for failure, Patch kind of has a backstop where we have kind of financial and legal recourse and guardrails put in place to make sure, if there were something to go off the rails, we have that backstop. But the whole point is, even in that worst case scenario, the effect is minimized because you spread your poker chips, if you will, across many different options.
Makes perfect sense. I was sort of curious. You guys have had a really good year. Congrats on the recent round, securing investment from Andreessen Horowitz and other VCs. Could you talk a little bit about, just fundraising for a climate fintech, maybe some advice that you could pass on to other entrepreneurs on how they should approach that?
Yeah, absolutely. So with the seed round, and really like any other kind of investor conversations I have now, or actually we don't really position ourselves as a climate tech business. We really position ourselves as an infrastructure/marketplace business for an emerging market that happens to be climate related. For whatever reason, private investing is a very, for better or for worse, especially at the earliest stages, a very like human game. And there tends to be a lot of anchoring on that. You're looking at, you might not have a lot of baseline data to base like an investment decision on. And so you really have to understand like, okay, what are like the theoretical assumptions we have to make in order to believe this is going to exist? And so when you talk about climate, the question of like, oh, well, are people going to care about this, et cetera, typically crops up. And, we definitively know that is the case, but there's still always like a bit of mental overhead. That being said, this most recent round, we kind of went and saying, no, we are an infrastructure marketplace business. This is the rate this market is growing at. And this is like the analogy to fintech or to e-commerce or to something else. And that actually really dramatically accelerates conversations because, well, for better or for worse, venture capitalists typically rely on pattern matching. And they don't understand the pattern for climate tech. They only remember 2006, 2007 when everything went out, there was a disaster essentially with R&D risk. So you don't want to be matched against that pattern. The pattern you want to be matched against are the fintech patterns or the e-commerce patterns from the last 5 or 6 years. And so that's really what we've leaned on, which is how those people built their businesses successfully. And what can we do to best position ourselves to follow a very similar playbook? If the market doesn't develop, we believe it does. If it doesn't, you're kind of doomed anyway. So it's really all about how you focus on what's in your control. And typically that's strategy and how you build the business. And if the market doesn't come, it doesn't come. That being said, we obviously think it will, but you have to really focus on what is and what isn't in your control. And anchoring on the climate idea really is not in your control. Building an infrastructure business is very much in your control.
You guys have gained a lot of traction over the last year and have a lot of different kinds of customers now. I guess I was sort of curious what your take is on that customer acquisition journey and why there's so much increased interest in your technology from all these different stakeholders.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it really starts with consumers, right? At the end of the day, millennials are entering their prime earning years. Gen Z is just beginning to vote and to spend. And these are the first 2 generations that are going to be profoundly impacted by climate change in their lifetime if like dramatic action isn't taken. And as a result, this percolates to both the ballot box, but also on how people spend money. For some, I think it's like the top, 10 fastest growing D2C brands all have some sort of sustainability elements to them, whether it's Allbirds or Everlane. And so more and more, we're seeing this not just being a nice to have, but actually an expectation to be built in to kind of the fabric of your business. And so as a result, this is kind of top of mind for both boards, capital allocators, like EQT, the private equity fund, is actually a Patch customer. Like there's a huge number of people beginning to think about this because they know time's up and essentially they're gonna have to do something really dramatic in the next 5 to 10 years. And so as a result, like there's the option of trying to get smart on it and kind of building everything from scratch. or just kind of a build use case, or you kind of can partner or borrow and work with someone like Patch. And so, especially in, we have the privilege of being in Silicon Valley, a lot of people understand software and APIs. And so you're really kind of speaking their language where they're like, I know I need to do something climate. I understand APIs. Again, going back to the pattern matching thing, Patch makes actually a lot of sense for X, Y, and Z reason. That's not all Patch is. There's kind of other stuff behind the scenes, but that's kind of what's always driven the initial interest. That's really kind of gotten us in the door. And then, we take advantage or, put our best foot once we're in the door. But what really attracts people is a combination of those elements.
Well, I'm a huge fan and really excited for you guys, and also excited that you've joined us on this Cards and Payments Challenge initiative. Just a shameless plug, the open call is open right now and runs till October 1st. We've got 100K first place prize, 40K for second, 25K for third. But I think what's more exciting about it is actually just the sort of eagerness of the corporate partners to support and want to initiate proof of concepts with the participants, with the applicants. And I guess, Brennan, I was kind of curious from your take, what are you guys looking for? What would you be excited to engage with?
Yeah, true. What's actually fascinating is, we when we first started Patch, we really thought like travel and e-commerce were going to be the biggest things for us. And now that's been wrong. That was a completely wrong assumption that we had like 8 months ago. And now it's been primarily financial and crypto applications. And we've just been generally surprised by the amount of creativity people have had, which is also the beauty of starting an API company. You basically get to create a Lego brick and then give it to a bunch of people that are way smarter than you and watch what they build. And so for me, the thing that I always get excited about is just when I'm genuinely surprised. Like when I see a project where I'm like, I have literally never seen this before, never thought about this. I just find that generally exciting. Honestly, and this might be not what you want me to say, regardless of like practicality, like just something like truly, genuinely novel, I find exciting. I find it very hard to get surprised. As of late, going back to the pattern matching concept, I'm always like bucketing things, again, for better or for worse. So a genuine like novel application, I think would be really exciting. And seeing, we saw that already. And so I'm sure we haven't tapped out all the ideas out there. So really excited to see what people put together. And, it's the beauty of working with people way smarter than you is they come up with way better ideas.
I totally agree. And I'm really excited just having seen sort of a sneak peek after only a week of the applicants coming in. I think there's some really amazing ideas out there, and certainly things I hadn't seen before, even in some pretty in-depth research over the last couple of years. So really excited to sort of see what bubbles to the top and how we can put all these pieces together.
Totally.
Cool. Well, at this point, I think what we'll do is shift into Q&A. And I'm sorry to surprise the audience. I don't know if they were expecting that, but if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box that's somewhere in your Zoom interface. Even after all this time, I'm not an expert. But if you hit the chat button, you should be able to submit questions to Brennan or myself. And yeah, feel free to send them in.
Yeah, maybe as we wait for that, as the questions trickle in, since I'll match your shameless plug with one of my own, which
Please.
is Patch is aggressively hiring across product, engineering, design, marketing, go-to-market. We're hiring basically for everything. We're a 15-person company. We're going to be going to around 35 in the next 6 to 12 months. If you like software, if you like putting a dent in climate change, you definitely should shoot me a note. My email is Brennan, BRENNAN @patch.io. Super easy. I respond to every cold email I get.
Yeah, I did see you guys were hiring some pretty sweet roles there. So spread the word, certainly. I'm not seeing any questions, and I don't like to force it. Brennan and I are around and available to follow. Oh, we just got one. Sweet. Can you see that? Oh, there's two.
Yeah.
Now they're
absolutely.
all coming.
They're flowing in. So Joe.
Take the one from Joe.
Joe's a spicy one. So for those who can't see the Q&A box, Joe Garcia has asked, would love to hear Brennan's perspective on the critique of non-permanent offsets. So really quick, just a bit of context on what permanence is. For those who may not know, not every ton of carbon is created equal. There's this idea of permanence, which is how long does that positive environmental effect last for? On patch, there's actually a really large range. We have things that are permanent for around 100 to 150 years. Those are typically nature-based solutions, to as long as 10,000 plus. And so that's kind of the range that we operate in. There are some with shorter durations, things like 10 or 15 years. That's typically found in like soil sequestration, typically. And we don't have that type of inventory on the platform. We think that's a bit too small. So as far as my perspective on it, I don't know specifically what critique Joe is talking about. That being said, the idea of having work that you're essentially paying for, which is the carbon sequestration, not being in perpetuity, is understandably troubling for some people. I think the thing to consider though as well is like the running off the edge of the cliff, if you will, is actually happening in the next 50 years. And so there's actually most likely going to be an exercise where the work is not done by 2100 from a carbon removal perspective, where temporary carbon removal can actually do a fairly reasonable job buying us time, if you will, in addition to really rapid decarbonization. So again, like something that I really don't want to be lost here is like offsetting being a substitute for decarbonization. It is not. But that's a longer conversation. I understand we only have 4 minutes, so I don't want to derail the entire question. But non-temporary or non-permanent, carbon removal can be a great job to buy us time as we still allocate meaningful funding to more permanent forms of carbon removal to help get those cost curves down. But for better or for worse, the cost of truly permanent carbon removal, which is like 10,000 years plus, is prohibitively expensive. It's on the scale of $500 a ton. And so we need to continue to invest in those solutions to help get that down to the $100, $50 per ton range. And the way we're going to kind of have enough runway, if you will, to get there is by buying time with non-permanent forms of carbon removal. And so, the carbon markets, like many things, are kind of a great example. Like there are some folks that like permanent or perfect being the enemy of good, or good being the enemy of perfect. We don't have that approach here. And that's really why we take that portfolio approach we mentioned earlier, which is, allocate as much as you can to permanent, that you're going to help drive that cost curve down, then kind of help buy us time with temporary, and then always continuing to shift. And another way to think about it is if you have a permanent like dollar budget per year and you're decarbonizing, your budget per ton is going up over a year. And so you can always afford more and more expensive and theoretically more permanent forms of carbon removal, assuming you're decarbonizing rapidly enough. So that's what I would say about that.
We have 2 more questions, and maybe we can just go quick.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have one. What carbon projects are you most excited about?
Yeah, I personally have a soft spot for things for mineralization projects specifically. So this is the act of taking CO2, reacting it with some sort of mineral or salt, and then having that CO2 typically become a carbonate, which doesn't really matter what a carbonate is, but it's essentially another form of inert rock. And so there's this idea of coastal enhanced weathering, where you'll actually take this mineral, put it on the beach, and essentially the beach water agitating the rocks actually on the coastline, and this like mixing effect actually accelerates the carbon sequestration that happens because there's some carbon in the ocean as well. So I personally have an affinity for that just because of the almost like, again, going back to the novelty of it. There's actually really meaningful pathways to scaling that option, as well as it's actually highly creative, using both nature and technology in conjunction with one another to accomplish that form of carbon removal.
Awesome. And the last one is, could you speak to Patch's process for calculating our carbon footprint? How is Patch sourcing its data to create this work?
Yeah, absolutely. So Patch actually is not a full-blown carbon accounting tool. We actually sell to carbon accounting tools. So, when you think of carbon accounting, this is almost like an accounting system for carbon, where they take in all these inputs from your travel, your electricity bill, et cetera, come up with a number. They provide reduction opportunities, and then they offer compensation. That compensation feature in many carbon accounting tools is powered by Patch. So in many cases, we're actually not well suited to do the footprinting exercise, and we'll if you approach Patch with that type of requirement, we'll typically refer you to a partner we trust based on your needs. That being said, we do have APIs that allow transaction level footprinting. And the way we do that is we actually have models per transaction type, whether that's an Ethereum transaction on the blockchain, whether that is an airplane flown or a hamburger eaten, and based on essentially EPA and IPCC data, which are the kind of domestic and international climate change and kind of environmental agencies. There's high level, what are called empirical equations to estimate the carbon intensity of particular transactions. And we take all this information in and then produce it via API so people can get answers to all their questions electronically.
And one example of that would be Duconomy.
Exactly.
Awesome. I think we're at the end here and our timing is pretty good. So let's wrap it up. Yeah, thank you again for the time today, Brennan. Super interesting, and I think people will find this very helpful. Again, people should join us cnpchallenge.com on our current initiative. Thanks,
awesome.
everyone.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Brennan. Thanks, guys. Take care.